As I said at the top of the hour, this shooting was the 323rd shooting at a K-12 school this year in the U.S. To talk about the prevalence of school shootings, we're joined next by an expert who tracks these tragedies in real time. David Riedman is the founder of K-12 School Shooting Database. He's a professor of emergency services at Idaho State, and he's recorded every school shooting in the U.S. since 1966. Thank you for joining us today, David.
Thank you for having me back to the show. I wish it was under better circumstances both of these times.
I know. You were on the show just a few months ago to talk about another planned school attack at Mount Horeb, and maybe we can reference that in our conversation. But yes, you've been on before as tragedy strikes this community. But I want to maybe let's start by talking about the number, 323 shootings this year. That's almost one per day. And yet it feels as if, as a nation, we're numb to this terrible reality.
Yeah, it's important to understand, what is a shooting, what's a school shooting, what's a mass shooting, what's an active shooter. And all of those are just made up terms. None of them are actually legal terms. None of them are legal definitions. So in terms of shootings at school property, I look at every type of incident, and that's fights that escalate, it's domestic disputes, accidents, suicides, and planned attacks. Unfortunately, this year, like we saw this week in Madison, there have been 5 deliberately planned attacks at schools. 4 of them were by current students at those schools. So that's what gets all of the attention. But what happens almost every day is there's a fight that escalates into a shooting. And that also has an enormous impact on all of the students who witness it, students or staff who are shot or injured, and this feeling of safety in that entire school community.
Yeah. David, we got a question from a caller who is not on the line, but they ask, do the guests today know why it took so long to reunite students with their families? With the assumption or understanding that some students didn't get picked up until the evening on Monday.
When there's a shooting at a school, or even the threat of a shooting, there's a really prolonged law enforcement response. It's debatable whether it needs to be as long as it is, because it creates a lot of trauma for kids to be locked down for that period of time or to be away from their family for that period of time. But either way, the students really don't go anywhere until police have searched every room of the building. They do that looking for a second shooter, even though it's very rare that there's a second shooter. In fact, there's never been a second shooter hiding during an attack, either in a public space or an office or a school. But they do that anyway, regardless of the trauma it causes to the kids. And then once they're moved to a reunification center, the police will want to talk to each kid and find out if they saw anything or if they have any information about the perpetrator. And so they wouldn't let kids go until they've done an initial interview and some information gathering with all of them.
So it's part precaution and part investigation at the same time.
Absolutely. And then there also can be a lot of confusion in these complex incidents. Most deliberately planned attacks at schools happen in pretty small communities, usually rural communities or smaller suburban areas. And so that police department may be dealing with a really critical, complex incident like this for the first time. And for example, of all the things that went wrong in Uvalde, one of them was that a bus full of students got lost and weren't accounted for. So just managing a complex incident with hundreds of officers, with the media, with parents, sometimes somebody can forget to say, it's time for the kids to go home.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You said when we started this conversation that there are no legal categories for these shootings. And I guess that's something that I hadn't realized. And as Representative Pocan said earlier in the hour, there's really not a lot of national research or federal level research about school shootings. Can you talk about why that is and how you're standing in the gap?
Yeah, back to the 1990s, really as retaliation for the federal assault weapons ban. There's been congressional Republicans pushed through a block on really any funding for gun violence research with federal money. And so, we've learned so many things about pollution and chemicals and car accidents and cancer and all of these other things that kill children. And we've made significant progress over the last 40 years in dealing with almost every cause of death and harm to children. School shootings really haven't been studied. In 2018, I started this project a couple of days after Parkland. And if you had asked on the day of Parkland, how many times has somebody been shot at a school this year, that information was not available. If you wanted to know if the characteristics of the attack at Parkland were different from the planned attacks over the last 10 years, that was an impossible question to answer because nobody's studying them. There are a couple of federal level reports that come out each year. They're just high level findings. They don't have any meaningful or implementable recommendations in them, and they're not done in a way that's transparent or useful for academic researchers like myself to expand on those findings because they don't even share the raw data.
Wow. Knowledge is power. And it seems like those in power are withholding the resources that would be used to collect that knowledge and study it and potentially do something about it.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, when it comes down to it, a lot of these incidents are rooted in ease of access and availability to guns. Wisconsin doesn't have a law requiring guns to be locked in the house. And, we have to remember that while guns are a tool and a protected right, they're also a product. And there's been a large gun lobby and gun industry that's driven accessibility and removed friction. And when you have a dangerous product that's readily available, it ends up in the hands of kids.
Mm-hmm. And since you've been doing this research, you've found that there are some common denominators, themes, or trends in mass shootings and school shootings. Can you talk about what those are and how they might relate to this incident at the Abundant Life School?
Absolutely. And while we don't know the motives, there's lots of information, speculation that's flying around online. I'll stick to the facts that have come from official sources. And what we know in almost every school shooting is it is not a random spontaneous act. It's not a random mentally deranged outsider that tries to force their way into a school. It's almost always a current or a recently former student at that school who's talked about violence, talked about their interest in school shootings for weeks, months, or even years. And in the confirmed picture that's on the perpetrator's father's social media, she's standing at a shooting range and she's wearing a t-shirt that says KMFDM in huge letters on the back. And that is the most overt red flag that you could ever have, because that's the same t-shirt worn by the school shooters in Columbine. There's no reason for a 15-year-old in Wisconsin to be interested in a German punk band from the 90s, other than a connection to Columbine. So we need to understand that these shootings are connected. School shooters are working within imagery and ideology and symbols of what these attacks mean. They want to represent that crisis publicly. So wearing a t-shirt to a shooting range is saying to every adult there, somebody noticed this. Somebody asked me what's going wrong. Somebody intervened before this gets to the point of committing a school shooting. But the commonality, the first of many, is that there are these overt warnings and they're completely missed by the people around them.
Mm. Yeah, I have a sister who teaches in public school in fourth grade, and I've taught in higher education, have a lot of friends in education. And I remember the first active shooter training video that I watched, and like the kind of pervasive sense of dread that it gave me that, yes, this could happen where I am. This could happen in my community, in my school. And as you're talking about the kind of cry for help that maybe folks who are planning an attack might present, I want to ask you about how communities and institutions prepare, anticipate events like this in this day and age. From noticing warning signs to trainings, et cetera. What are folks doing?
Yeah, it's really important that you brought up that Department of Homeland Security active shooter training video from 2008, because that was not made by experts. That was not made by academics. That was a production company that was hired on a grant to create a public awareness campaign for the city of Houston. There's no empirical evidence behind that. And in fact, that what's depicted in the shooting really reinforces this damaging narrative, which, really harms us when we're trying to think about the ways to prevent or respond to this. That video depicts this scary, faceless, sunglassed, combat boots, black tactical person walking methodically throughout the building. They're not allowed to be there. They're busting their way in. It creates this narrative that there is this scary outsider, this scary other. And if we can just put a barrier between this bad monster and the good people, then we can protect, everyone here. That was perpetuated by the incoming vice president during the vice presidential debates. He said, you just need a stronger door on a school and you need more people with guns. What we need to understand is whether it's a shooting in a workplace, a shooting at a public place, or in this case, a shooting at a school, it is almost always somebody with a direct connection to that place. It's an insider. They're allowed to be there. They know the security. If it's a kid, they've been taught exactly how to respond to an active shooter since they were a kindergartner. But they've also been taught how to be an active shooter since they were a kindergartner. They have been told exactly what to do, where to go, how to find your victims, how to be powerful so everybody pays attention to you. So we've created all of these plans and procedures and fortification and securitization around a fantasy. And it's a convenient fantasy because nobody wants their kid to be a school shooter. Nobody wants to imagine their kid's friend is a school shooter. So it's easy to assume that person's another. But with school shootings, they almost always are a current student. They almost always start inside of the school, inside of any fortified areas. And they're done very, very quickly. As we saw in this case, the teenager commits suicide before the first police officer was there. That's the same thing that happened at the Seventh-day Adventist school in Northern California earlier this month. And it's the same thing that happened in Perry, Iowa in January when a Columbine-obsessed student who posted exactly the same music that this girl was wearing, the same T-shirt, he posted the song, but he killed himself before police arrived.
Yeah, so I hear you saying that this fantasy, the narrative around like this extremist outsider is part of the problem and why we can't prepare for, respond to, address kids who were hurting in our communities before these tragedies happen.
Yeah, I mean, we have a finite number of resources within a school or within a community or within a state government. And so those dollars can only go so many places. School fortification has become a $1 billion industry in the last couple of years. Of those school fortification items, whether it's a secure TSA style checkpoint, well, that's not realistic at a small private school with 300 kids. It's not realistic at an enormous 4,000 kid mega high school because you have 4,000 kids coming and going throughout your huge campus the entire day. So how are you going to corral them into one TSA security line and make them wait for 2 hours every time they go in and out of the building like we do at an airport? So we need to understand that those are all very expensive solutions. A school police officers in general are really expensive. Even if there had been an officer in this school, it probably would have been over before the officer even made it to the classroom. What's really cheap is community education, community reporting, and the types of people who intervene when somebody's in crisis, when somebody's thinking about committing suicide, when somebody's thinking about committing mass violence. They're having a lot of underlying issues before they get to that point. Social workers, counselors, school nurses, they all cost the fraction of a school police officer, and they are all the people who would have an effective intervention before you get to this crisis leading to violence. So I think we need to rethink a lot of these investments because we've spent tremendous amounts of money on things that probably don't work in very many circumstances. And we've gravely underfunded the types of services that every single student needs every day.
Thank you for that. And we've got two callers I want to address. We have one caller, Tim, who's not on the line, who had a question. He wonders, why do we use the term shooter? He thinks that it is a blasé word and something like killer or murderer would be better suited. Do you have any thoughts on how like the press, media, or public could refer to these events and the people who perpetrate them?
No, I think we're all guilty of playing into these narratives, myself included. But unfortunately, to talk about a niche topic, you really need kind of niche language, and we don't have convenient terminology to describe this. We do have a conflict that's really starting to arise, and that's about what should the public know and what should the public not know. Because we tell parents to look for red flags. We don't really tell parents in detail what those red flags are. If you never show a picture of the Columbine shooter, you don't realize that your kid is wearing the same t-shirt as the Columbine shooter. If you don't show pictures of the Parkland shooter, the parents don't know that kid, that shooter is the picture on their kid's wall or on their kid's social media. So we have a difficult situation where every kid who is drawn into this subculture is able to find this information on Discord, online, wherever they want it. If we keep these images off of kind of mass media, we're really only shielding the parents from it. We're not shielding the kids from this information. We're just making it something that the parents don't need to look at, the parents don't need to think about, that the parents can be oblivious to. And that kind of sits with this whole narrative. It's much easier to imagine an outsider. It's easier to make a shooter a nameless, faceless person because we don't have to deal with their identity. We don't have to deal with the missed opportunities that we had because they're a dangerous other. And that's been the convention of monster making for centuries in this country.
And I want to connect this to the research that you've been doing over the years since 1966. Can you talk about the trends, the increase in planned attacks over the years, and kind of connect that to the narrative that the fantasy of this outsider figure that you talked about?
Yes. So, as I said at the top of the show, I track all types of shootings on school property. And those are even shootings where a gun is fired, but the shots miss. If you take any one of the ways that you can measure this data, shootings on school property, victims wounded, victims killed, active shooters, deliberately planned attacks, near misses where it could have been much worse, shootings with 4 people, 4 victims, shootings with 4 victims killed, all of these different ways that this can be measured. Every single one of those measures shows an upward trend. So regardless of how you define or quantify this problem, the trend is going in the wrong direction. And it's especially increasing in the last 6 or 7 years. So as we've put more money into this, as we put more money into school policing, as we put more money into fortification, shootings are becoming more frequent and more deadly and more victims. So something is going very wrong.
And there's no decrease in the access that people have to firearms at the same time.
No, I mean, the common thread, as I said earlier, almost always, current or former students at the school, they're usually between 13 and 17 years old. About 95% of them are men or boys, but girls have committed these shootings too. In 2021 in Rigby, Idaho, very small rural area, there was a 12-year-old girl, and she wrote in her notebook that she wanted to kill 20 to 30 classmates so that she could be the most deadly school shooter of all time. And she came out of the bathroom and opened fire in the hallway, and she wounded 2 students and the janitor. And because she's a 12-year-old girl, a teacher happened to be coming right out of the classroom and just grabbed her in a bear hug and took the gun away. But that had the intent and capability and armament to be one of the worst school shootings in history. So I think the takeaway from this is deliberate attacks have happened every year since the 1960s. Even before social media or violent video games or R-rated movies, they all pretty much follow the same patterns. They're perpetrated in the same ways. They usually end before law enforcement has any sort of intervention, and they happen inside whatever area you're trying to secure against an outsider. And so I think all of those data points show that we really need to completely reframe the way that we think about and address this, because we can't securitize ourselves out of this. We can't police ourselves out of this.
And what about policy from your angle?
One of the simplest policies that can prevent almost every one of these school shootings is requiring guns to be locked. If a gun is locked, a kid can't get to it. The kid can't go to the store and buy the gun. A kid can't go to a gun show and buy a gun. But if a kid can take a gun from their house, they can take that gun to school. And most of these shootings are committed with handguns. AR-15 rifles are extremely serious. That is a major problem, to have a weapon that's designed specifically to kill people used inside a school or public place. But the majority of these school shootings happen with a handgun. That's because it's easy to sneak into the school. It's easy for a kid to get, and they are so cheap and accessible now that adults might not even think about them as a serious item that they need to account for all the time. So we've got to make sure that every single person who owns a gun keeps that gun locked up all the time, because an unsecured gun can be a gun that ends up in a school. If we could just put that on a bumper sticker, that there's no gun owner that wants their gun to be used in a school shooting. So keep it locked up, and there's no way that can happen.
Yeah. And we got a caller, Don, who wanted to comment about the band tee that the shooter on Monday was wearing in a photo, who said that the band gave a concert in Milwaukee this year. And I wonder if that's just a piece of clarification or wanting to confirm, that maybe this person came about it a different way. But again, we can't really know motive, and we don't know a lot of details here. So, David, do you want to respond or clarify?
I think that it's important, regardless of where this T-shirt came from, for parents to know the symbols that are common with school shootings. And if you see one of those symbols or people or images that your kid has posted or your kid is wearing, ask them why. Some adult, if they had asked this girl, why are you wearing the shirt? What does that mean to you? Do you know if it symbolizes anything? There was an opportunity there to intervene, to see a crisis. Based on some reporting from the Washington Post, there was a somewhat chaotic home life with the parents being divorced twice and remarried, and back and forth custody. So, when you have a child that is exhibiting some sort of signs of trauma, they may have some unresolved issues. They may be in the early phases of a crisis. The first part of that is going to be asking for help. And wearing a T-shirt that represents the Columbine shooting may be that first cry for help. So a parent just needs to realize those symbols and just have a conversation right there. And hopefully it's nothing.
Yeah, I hear you saying that we have to pay attention and show a lot of care to people around us. There's also work that can be done at a higher scale of asking for better policies and from our schools and from our elected officials at local, state, and national levels. There's a lot to this complex story. And David, I'm glad you were here to share your perspective, your research, which is so important, and folks can find that online. Could you give your website for us, please?
Yes, anybody can just search K through 12 school shooting database, and it will come up immediately. There are interactive maps, graphics, and you can also subscribe to my Substack. I publish articles and podcasts every week that are specifically about preventing school shootings and the data analysis behind them.
Thank you for joining us, David. And you've been listening to A Public Affair. I'm your guest host today, Sarah Gabler. You can continue to follow WORT for up-to-date, accurate, and timely information about the school shooting on Monday and its aftermath, including information on our website and the web post for this show about resources that the city of Madison is making available to folks. I want to thank our sound engineer, Jay, our receptionist, Mary Jo, producer, Jade Isiri Ramos, and news director, Shali Pittman. Up next is Letters and Politics. Keep it tuned to WORT 89.9 FM Madison.